Now let's look at some of the key inputs and outputs of each phase within this iteration. For phase B, an approved statement of architecture work is a key input. Along with this, the architecture vision document and all other outcomes produced by architecture vision phase form the key inputs. In addition, this phase also expects to have the architecture repository available and accessible to relevant stakeholders as a requirement going into this phase. The key outputs of this phase include draft of an early version of architecture definition document, elaborating business architecture building blocks, relevant architecture models directed at business stakeholders, illustrating current and target state architecture, the gap identified and proposed architecture options, the pros and cons of each, and any early recommendations, as well as any constraints that may apply on information systems or technology architectures. This phase also provides a candidate architecture roadmap purely from a business architecture perspective. These outputs are for the consumption of key business stakeholders in order to elicit their feedback and inputs, and they also form inputs for the next phase of architecture development, that is, the information systems architecture, or phase C. The inputs used for phase B, such as architecture vision and statement of architecture work, are also key inputs into phase C. Phase C, in addition, also uses any existing data or applications architecture artifacts already available in the architecture repository, and also any applicable architecture reference models which could potentially be reused. The output from this phase will further flesh out the architecture definition document with applications and data architecture building blocks, elaborating on the current and target architectures and gaps that exist. Typically, this leads to creation of the enterprise's data inventory, logical data models, applications portfolio catalog, interoperability requirements, integration requirements, areas where business architecture need to change to accommodate data or applications architecture requirements, constraints that would be applicable for technology architecture, and so forth. Much of the outputs of phases A, B, and C form the inputs of phase D, or technology architecture phase, especially the requirements, the roadmaps, and constraints called out in earlier phases as being applicable to phase D. In addition to these, any existing technology architecture artifacts already available in the architecture repository and generic architecture reference models which can potentially be reused form the inputs for this phase. The output of technology architecture phase is once again the sections of the architecture definition document. However, in this case, as expected, it describes the architecture of the technology infrastructure, and typically it defines the technology stack for the implementation of the solution, the relationship between technology and information systems building block in terms of the hosting environments, the deployment considerations for various stages of the deployment pipeline, expected load, capacity and performance requirements, specifications for servers, physical and virtual networks, and so forth. Now that basically concludes our overview of architecture development iteration. Next, let's look at what's cooking at Web First Banking Corporation.